We bring in Republican Congressman from Wisconsin, Mike Gallagher. He is chair of the Select Committee on the CCP. He also sits on the Armed Services and Intelligence Committees and served 7 years in active duty with the United States Marines, 2 deployments in Iraq. Congressman, it's always good to have you with us. Thank you very much for joining us. You know, one of the things we've seen is the failure of deterrence here. And I just want to highlight what Alex just mentioned from the former Secretary of State and CIA Director, Mike Pompeo, from the hearing that you had in your committee today. Watch this.
We've got deterrence lost in Europe. We have deterrence lost in the Middle East. We are on the cusp of losing that very deterrent model in Asia as well. One could argue that elements of that have already been lost.
So what was the biggest takeaway for you from this hearing? And, you know, I should point out, we live in an environment where you have a lot of people in the country who don't want to see us involved in any more foreign wars.
The biggest takeaway for me is that for those, particularly on Wall Street and American corporate industry, who would discount the likelihood that Xi Jinping could start a war over Taiwan, you're living in a fantasy land. Because what we have seen in Europe, as Secretary Pompeo aptly pointed out, what we've seen in the Middle East is that dictators, hostile regimes may do something that seems irrational from a Western perspective, but makes sense from their perspective, which is based solely on regime preservation. The other big takeaway is that the balance of power, particularly the conventional balance of power in the Indo-Pacific, our priority theater, is going in the wrong direction. We need to urgently invest in our own defense to do what Secretary Panetta said, a Democratic defense secretary. We need to reestablish peace through strength. The logic of deterrence is actually quite simple. We all learned it on the playground. If we do not have strength, if we continue to project weakness, we could find ourselves stumbling into a war in the Pacific, which will make the current crisis in the Middle East and the current crisis in Ukraine look like child's play in comparison.
So clearly China, you know, is in a better position because of what's going on in Ukraine. We also, and because of what's going on in Iran and Iran's constant attacks against U.S. bases. How much does China benefit from what is now being viewed as the Biden administration essentially trying to ignore the Middle East for the past few years?
Yeah, and even worse than that, I would say having a deliberate policy of what they might call détente or rapprochement with Iran, but what we can more accurately call appeasement. From the start of this administration, trying to revive the Iran deal, which basically legitimized their industrial-scale nuclear program, delisting the Houthis, now placing restrictions on aid to Israel. The list is much longer than that, but effectively we've had a policy of appeasement with respect to Iran, and therefore Iran has grown more aggressive. The North Star for this administration has been fear of provoking Iran, and they fail to see that that fear itself is provocative because it emboldens our enemies. And I think China similarly is looking at our response both in Europe and the Middle East and trying to figure out, well, might now be a good time to test the United States when they don't seem to want to invest in their own military and when their commander-in-chief keeps sending these signals of weakness on the world stage and when they're internally distracted by a presidential election. I fear we've entered the window of maximum danger, which is why men and women of good faith in both parties need to come together, put away all the childish political shenanigans, and start to restore deterrence and peace through strength.
Before I let you go, I just want to play this from the White House press secretary and get your reaction to it as a veteran. It's gotten a lot of attention. Listen to this.
Our deepest condolences go out, and our heartfelt condolences go out to the families who lost three folks who are military folks, who are brave, who are always fighting, who are fighting on behalf of this administration, of the American people. Obviously, more importantly, we lost those souls.
What goes through your mind when you hear that, Congressman?
I mean, clearly, she can't even talk with a basic fluency about how to describe military issues. Now, I don't expect her to talk with the same fluency as someone who's on active duty, but, I mean, it's just troubling. I mean, she's the press secretary for the Biden administration. I think it undermines the gravity of the situation.